Chapter 1. The first fine one I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I had finally found the perfect place to settle down. The houses were neatly kept, the streets were quiet, and everything seemed designed to give that postcard perfect suburban feel. I had worked hard to afford my home, and I was proud of it. For me, this was more than just a house. It was a symbol of years of sacrifice, long hours at work, and countless setbacks I had fought to overcome. But what I didn't know at the time was that behind this picture-perfect neighborhood lay a nightmare I never asked for, and it came in the form of the Homeowners Association. The HOA was supposed to keep the community organized, to enforce fair rules that kept property values high. At least, that's what I was told. In reality, they were nothing more than a group of power-hungry neighbors with too much time on their hands. People who found joy in controlling others, nitpicking every detail of someone else's property while ignoring their own issues. And unfortunately for me, I caught their attention almost immediately. The first letter came just 2 weeks after I had moved in. It was stuffed into my mailbox, printed on official-looking letterhead with a tone that screamed arrogance. According to them, my trash cans were divisible from the street and violated community standards. They demanded I move them behind my fence or face a $100 fine. I brushed it off as nothing more than a nuisance. After all, I had just unpacked and was still getting everything organized. But little did I know, this was just the beginning of their campaign against me. Not even a week later, I got another notice. This time, they claimed my lawn was not uniformly green and accused me of neglecting yard maintenance. Never mind the fact that it had rained non-stop for days and the patches of mud were for my dogs running in the backyard. They didn't care. The letter stated that if I didn't correct the violation immediately, I'd be fined $500 per day. That number hit me like a punch to the gut. $500 every single day for a yard that had a few muddy spots. It felt insane, like something out of a bad TV drama. I thought it had to be a mistake. Surely no one would actually enforce such an absurd fine. But when I called the HOA office, I was greeted with cold indifference. The woman on the phone told me, flatly, that rules were rules and that if I didn't comply, the fines would continue to accumulate without limit. Her tone carried that smug confidence of someone who had said these words 1,000 times before, crushing one homeowner after another. It was clear they thrived on intimidation. For a while, I tried to play along. I reseeded the yard, paid for professional landscaping, even bought new sod to patch the areas they claimed were a problem. But it didn't matter. A week later, another letter arrived. This time, they said my mailbox was not painted the approved color and threatened me again with daily fines. The constant harassment felt targeted, like they had decided I was their new project. Every small detail of my property became their obsession, and every letter they sent had a new outrageous demand attached to it. The stress started to build. I couldn't relax in my own home anymore. Every time I pulled into my driveway, I wondered what fresh complaint they had waiting for me. And when the $500 daily fines started stacking up in their system, I felt trapped. They sent me statements showing thousands of dollars owed all over nonsense that most people wouldn't even notice. I began to realize the HOA wasn't about community or fairness, it was about control and money. At first, I felt helpless. How could I fight an entire board of people with bylaws and legal authority on their side? They seemed untouchable. That's exactly how they wanted homeowners to feel, isolated and powerless. But as the weeks went by, something inside me shifted. I was tired of being bullied, tired of living in fear of a piece of paper shoved in my mailbox. I wasn't going to let them ruin the home I had worked so hard for. If they wanted a fight, I would give them one. That's when I started digging. I researched everything I could about HOA laws in my state. I read case after case of homeowners fighting back, some losing, but others managing to turn the tables. I discovered that HOAs weren't as invincible as they pretended to be. They had rules, yes, but they also had obligations. They were required to operate fairly, to enforce rules consistently, and to follow the law just like everyone else. And if they didn't, well, there were consequences. The more I read, the angrier I became. The fines they were hitting me with were not only outrageous, but in many ways illegal. They were selectively targeting me while ignoring violations from other residents. My next-door neighbor had a mailbox painted a bright blue color, yet there was no letter in his box. Another family down the street had dead patches of grass covering half their yard, and they hadn't been fined a dime. The HOA wasn't enforcing rules. They were targeting me specifically. That realization lit a fire under me. I wasn't just going to fight back, I was going to make them regret ever messing with me. And I knew exactly how I would do it. The $500 a day fines were meant to scare me into compliance. But instead of caving, I decided to let them pile up. The more ridiculous their demands became, the more evidence I gathered. Every letter, every photo, every notice, they all became ammunition. I started building a case, one that would expose just how corrupt and unfair the HOA really was. And the more I dug, the uglier the truth became. I discovered financial mismanagement, selective enforcement, and even illegal practices buried within their own documents. The very people who claimed to be protecting the community were in fact abusing their power for personal gain, and I wasn't going to keep quiet about it. By the end of that first month, I had a binder full of evidence and a burning determination to take them down. What they thought was a simple homeowner they could bully into submission was actually someone ready to fight them with everything he had. And so, as the fines continued to rise higher and higher, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to war with the HOA, but little did I know the battle ahead would be bigger, nastier, and far more explosive than I could have ever imagined. Chapter 2. The investigation. As the weeks dragged on, the HOA continued to tighten the screws. Every morning when I checked my mailbox, it felt like opening a fresh wound. More letters, more accusations, more fines piling onto the mountain of debt they claimed I owed. By now, the total was climbing into the tens of thousands. They weren't just trying to find me, they were trying to break me. They wanted me to either surrender or lose my home. And for most people, that would have been enough. But not for me. I had already made up my mind. I wasn't going to roll over. I was going to fight. And the first step was uncovering exactly how the HOA operated behind the scenes. If they were going to wage war against me, I needed to know their every weakness. I started by requesting access to the HOAS records. Under state law, homeowners had the right to review financial documents, meeting minutes, and enforcement reports. Of course, the board didn't make it easy. They stalled, they ignored my emails, and they acted as though I had no right to see anything. But I was persistent. I sent certified letters. I cited the exact laws they were violating, and I made it clear that their refusal to comply only made them look guilty. Eventually, they caved, handing over a stack of documents they clearly hoped I wouldn't understand. But I did understand. And what I found shocked me. The financial statements were a mess. Huge sums of money were being withdrawn from HOA accounts. FOR vague maintenance and administrative costs. There were checks written to board members with no explanation. Landscaping expenses were inflated to absurd levels, far beyond what it should cost to mow a few lawns and trim some bushes. And then there were the selective enforcement logs. These were the records of every violation the HOA had supposedly issued to homeowners. My name appeared over and over again, while many other obvious violations in the neighborhood had been completely ignored. It became clear this wasn't about community standards. This was about greed. The board was abusing their power, siphoning money for themselves, and targeting homeowners like me to keep the system afloat. They relied on fear and intimidation to keep people from questioning them. and anyone who pushed back was crushed under the weight of endless fines, but I wasn't alone. As I dug deeper, I began to quietly talk to some of my neighbors. At first, people were hesitant. No one wanted to be the next target of the HOAs wrath, but slowly stories started to emerge. One family told me they had been fined for having their blinds the wrong shade of white. Another said they were threatened with foreclosure after falling behind on dues, even though they had already worked out a payment plan. The more people I spoke to, the more I realized just how widespread the HOAS corruption was. It wasn't just me. It was everyone. And with every new story, my determination grew. This wasn't just about saving my own home anymore. It was about exposing the truth and protecting the entire community from the people who had been exploiting us for years. The next step was to gather hard evidence. I started taking photos, documenting everything around the neighborhood. I photographed the bright blue mailbox that had never been fined. I documented the dead grass in other yards that had been conveniently ignored. I even recorded the board president's house, where he had built a massive shed in violation of the bylaws, something that would have earned anyone else thousands in fines. Bit by bit, I built a mountain of proof that the HOA was breaking their own rules. And with every piece of evidence, I felt the balance of power begin to shift, but evidence alone wouldn't be enough. I needed allies, so I began quietly organizing my neighbors. We met in living rooms, backyards, and sometimes even at coffee shops outside the neighborhood to avoid suspicion. I showed them the financial records, the inflated expenses, the selective enforcement. At first, there was shock, then anger. People who had once lived in fear of the HOA were now realizing that the board wasn't all powerful, they were vulnerable. That's when I suggested the unthinkable, taking legal action. Most of my neighbors had never considered it. The HOA felt untouchable. But as I laid out the evidence, I saw their hesitation turn into resolve. One by one, they agreed to stand with me. We would fight back, not just as individuals, but as a united front. Of course, word got back to the board. They must have sensed something was happening because the harassment escalated. Suddenly, I was accused of leaving my Christmas lights up too long, of parking too close to the curb, even of having my garage door open for more than 15 minutes. Each new violation came with threats of more fines, more legal consequences. It was clear they were trying to break me before I could strike, but instead of breaking, I grew stronger. Every new letter went straight into my binder, another piece of evidence to show the absurdity of their crusade against me. They thought they were burying me in paperwork, but in reality, they were digging their own grave. The tipping point came when I discovered something buried deep in the financial records. A series of large payments labeled as consulting fees. At first glance, they looked like legitimate business expenses. But when I traced the payments, I realized they were going directly to the board president's personal bank account. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was embezzlement. That discovery changed everything. This wasn't just a petty power struggle anymore. This was criminal. And it gave me the leverage I needed to bring the HOA to its knees. By now, I had assembled a team of angry homeowners, a binder full of evidence, and the smoking gun of financial corruption. The next step was clear. We were going to court, but before we could file our case, the HOA struck first. They sent me an official notice threatening foreclosure on my home, claiming I owed over $60,000 in unpaid fines and fees. They wanted to scare me into submission, to make me back down before I could expose them. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Their arrogance only fueled my resolve. They thought they could take my home. They had no idea what was coming, because now it wasn't just me versus the HOA. It was me, my neighbors, and the law. And soon, the board would find themselves standing in front of a judge, forced to answer for every crooked decision they had ever made. The war was about to leave the neighborhood and move into the courtroom, and I was ready for battle. Chapter 3. The courtroom showdown. The moment I received the foreclosure notice, I knew the HOA had made a critical mistake. They had pushed too far. They weren't just issuing fines anymore, they were threatening to strip me of the very home I had sacrificed so much to earn. And by doing so, they gave me the perfect opportunity to take them down. Instead of running, I filed a lawsuit. The case wasn't just about me. It was about years of corruption, selective enforcement, and financial abuse that had plagued the entire neighborhood. From the very beginning, the board underestimated me. They thought I was just another frustrated homeowner lashing out in desperation. But when my attorney filed the complaint, backed by a binder full of evidence and sworn statements from my neighbors, the HOA realized they weren't dealing with someone they could easily intimidate. They had awoken something they couldn't control. The weeks leading up to the court date were filled with tension. The HOA board tried every trick in the book to discredit me. They spread rumors through the neighborhood, calling me a troublemaker, a liar, and even accusing me of fabricating evidence. They issued new fines, hoping to overwhelm me before the case began. But the more they attacked, the stronger my case grew. Every petty move, every retaliatory letter became another example of their harassment. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. Walking into that courthouse, I felt the weight of the entire neighborhood on my shoulders. Dozens of homeowners had shown up to support me, many of them fed up with years of bullying from the board. For the first time, the HOA was on the defensive, forced to justify their actions not with smug letters or intimidation, but in front of a judge. The board members sat together at the defense table, their expressions a mix of arrogance and unease. At the center was the board president, the man who had orchestrated much of the harassment against me. He looked confident, as though he still believed this was all beneath him, as if a single homeowner could never stand against the full power of the HOA. But that confidence began to crack the moment the evidence was laid out. My attorney started with the basics, showing the judge the outrageous fines. Page after page of violations for trivial or fabricated issues. Grass too short, grass too long, mailbox the wrong color, garage door open too long. Each violation came with an escalating fine, many of them $500 a day, all of them adding up to an absurd total of more than $60,000. The courtroom grew quiet as the judge flipped through the stack of letters, eyebrows raised in disbelief. Then came the comparisons. Photos of my neighbors' properties and painted mailboxes, patchy lawns, sheds that violated code, all of which had never been fined. The selective enforcement was undeniable. The HOAS claimed that they were simply upholding standards began to crumble before everyone's eyes, but the real blow came when we introduced the financial records. I could feel the tension in the room shift as my attorney highlighted the so-called consulting fees. The payments, traced directly into the board president's personal account, were impossible to explain away. Suddenly, this wasn't just about unfair fines anymore, it was about fraud. The very people entrusted to manage the communities, money had been lining their own pockets. The HOAS lawyers scrambled to spin the narrative. They argued that I was a disgruntled homeowner, that the board had acted in good faith, that the payments were legitimate reimbursements. But every excuse was met with evidence to the contrary. Every attempt to paint me as a troublemaker only made the board look more desperate, and as the testimony continued, my neighbors' voices joined the fight. One by one, they recounted their own stories of harassment and abuse. Families fined for trivialities, threats of foreclosure over minor dues disputes, selective enforcement that targeted anyone who dared to speak up. The pattern was undeniable. By the time the hearing ended, the board members no longer looked confident. Their smug expressions had faded, replaced by the pale realization that they were losing control. The judge didn't issue a ruling that day, but his words were clear. The allegations were serious, the evidence substantial, and the board would be held accountable. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt something I hadn't felt in months' hope. For the first time, it wasn't me being crushed under the weight of the HOA. It was them scrambling to defend their corruption, their lies, and their greed. But even as I felt that hope, I knew the battle was far from over. The board wasn't going to surrender quietly. They had too much power, too much money, and too much pride at stake. Over the next few weeks, the HOA doubled down. They launched smear campaigns, sent threatening letters, and even tried to intimidate some of my neighbors into withdrawing their support. But it was too late. The community had seen the truth. The more the board lashed out, the more obvious their desperation became. Behind the scenes, my attorney prepared for the next phase of the case. We weren't just asking the court to dismiss the fines, we were demanding an audit of the HOA's finances, restitution for homeowners who had been wronged, and removal of the corrupt board members. The stakes had never been higher, and then came the moment that turned everything upside down. During the audit, investigators uncovered not just mismanagement, but outright theft on a massive scale. Tens of thousands of dollars had been siphoned from the HOAS accounts over the years. The board president and his allies had treated community funds like their personal bank account. Vacations, luxury purchases, even home renovations paid. For with money taken from the very homeowners they were supposed to serve, the discovery was explosive. It wasn't just a civil matter anymore, it was criminal. And suddenly, the board members who had spent months tormenting me were facing something far worse than losing a lawsuit. They were facing potential charges. As news of the investigation spread through the neighborhood, everything changed. Homeowners who had once lived in fear of the HOA now openly mocked the board. The power dynamic flipped overnight. The bullies had become the hunted, scrambling to cover their tracks as the walls closed in around them. But even with the evidence mounting against them, the board wasn't finished yet. In a desperate attempt to save themselves, they tried to rally what little support they had left, calling an emergency meeting of the HOA. Their goal was simple: to convince the community that I was the villain, that my lawsuit would destroy the neighborhood, and that the only way to save the community was to stand behind them. What they didn't realize was that the community was no longer under their control. And when that meeting finally came, it would prove to be the turning point, the moment when the neighborhood itself rose up and decided the board's fate. Chapter 4, the Neighborhood Revolt Emergency Meeting, was scheduled for a Thursday evening, held at the community clubhouse, a place that, until now, had always been a symbol of the HOAS authority. But this time, the atmosphere was different. Instead of quiet compliance, there was a restless energy in the air, a growing anger that couldn't be silenced. Word of the audit and the financial misconduct had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. For years, people had whispered about the HOAS corruption, but now there was proof. And with proof came outrage. When I arrived, the parking lot was already full. Homeowners stood in clusters, talking in hushed but excited voices. Some carried folders of their own letters and fines, ready to confront the board. Others just came to see the showdown they had been waiting for. The HOA board had ruled over us with an iron fist for so long that the idea of finally holding them accountable was almost too good to be true. Inside the clubhouse, the board sat at a long table, at the front of the room, looking more nervous than I had ever seen them. The president, who had always carried himself with smug arrogance, now had a tightness around his eyes that betrayed his fear. He tapped his fingers against the table, scanning the room as if he could somehow intimidate the crowd into silence. But the usual fear that once filled these meetings was gone. The homeowners weren't afraid anymore, they were furious. The meeting began with the board's desperate attempt to control the narrative. The president launched into a long speech about unfounded allegations, claiming the lawsuit was baseless and that the audit results had been misinterpreted. He painted me as the villain, accusing me of trying to destroy the community out of spite. According to him, the real danger wasn't the board's actions, but my lawsuit. If the court ruled against them, he warned, the neighborhood would face bankruptcy, property values would collapse, and chaos would reign. For a moment, the room was silent, but then one homeowner stood up. She had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade and had endured countless fines for trivial issues: her flower beds, her holiday decorations, even the color of her shutters. With her voice trembling from years of frustration, she told the room exactly what the HOA had done to her family. The board tried to cut her off, but the crowd erupted in support. People shouted for her to keep going, and she did. Her story opened the floodgates. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their experiences. A man spoke about being threatened with foreclosure after missing a single dues payment. Another recounted how the board had ignored real maintenance issues, like broken street lights and damaged sidewalks, while obsessing over the color of someone's garage door. Each story painted the same picture: a board that abused its power, ignored its responsibilities, and preyed on the very people it was supposed to serve. The president's attempts to regain control only made things worse. Every time he interrupted, every time he dismissed a homeowner's complaint, the anger in the room grew. The crowd wasn't buying his excuses anymore. They had lived under his rule long enough to know the truth, and now that truth was out in the open for everyone to see. By the time I stood up, the tension was thick in the air. I didn't need to raise my voice. I simply laid out the facts: the selective enforcement, the outrageous fines, the financial records showing money funneled into personal accounts. I didn't have to embellish or dramatize. It was all there in black and white. And as I spoke, I could see the board shrinking before me, their authority crumbling under the weight of their own corruption. Then came the moment that changed everything. A homeowner in the back of the room shouted what everyone was thinking: "We want a vote." The words echoed through the clubhouse, followed by a chorus of agreement. The bylaws were clear: if enough homeowners voted, the board could be dissolved, its members removed, and new leadership elected. The president tried to argue, to stall, to twist the rules in his favor, but it was no use. The crowd had spoken. The vote was messy, chaotic, and louder than any meeting the neighborhood had ever seen. But when the dust settled, the result was undeniable. The board had been overthrown. For the first time in years, the homeowners were free from their grip. The room erupted in cheers. People hugged, clapped, and shouted with relief. Some were crying, overwhelmed by the realization that the nightmare was finally ending. The board members sat stunned, pale and silent, as the community they had once ruled turned against them. In unison, their power was gone, and there was nothing they could do to get it back. But while the revolt marked a turning point, it wasn't the end. The lawsuit was still active, the financial investigation ongoing. The board members were no longer in control, but their actions had left scars on the community, scars that wouldn't heal overnight. The neighborhood needed new leadership, and justice still had to be served. In the days that followed, the sense of unity in the community grew stronger. Neighbors who had once avoided each other out of fear of being reported now stopped to talk, to share, to plan for a future without the board's constant interference. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like a community again. But for me, the fight wasn't finished. The audit had uncovered fraud, and the lawsuit was still working its way through the courts. The former board members weren't just guilty of being bullies, they were guilty of crimes. And until they faced the full consequences of their actions, I wasn't satisfied. The revolt had been a victory, yes. But it was only the beginning of the end. The real justice was still ahead. And as the former board members scrambled to cover their tracks and protect themselves from the fallout, I knew their reckoning was coming, because now it wasn't just about saving my home or even dismantling the HOAS power. It was about accountability. It was about making sure the people who had abused their positions of trust faced the consequences of what they had done, and that reckoning was closer than they realized. Chapter 5. The reckoning courtroom was packed. Residents whispered among themselves, some nervously clutching papers while others leaned forward in anticipation. The case had grown beyond a simple dispute over fines. It had become a spectacle, a defining battle between an individual homeowner and the seemingly unstoppable machinery of the HOA. The air buzzed with tension as the judge entered and the proceedings began. The HOAS lawyers were sharp and polished, armed with binders full of documents, while I sat with my modest stack of carefully organized evidence. To anyone watching, it may have looked like an uneven fight, but I knew the strength of what I had uncovered. The HOA presented its case first, laying out what they called a clear and consistent history of violations. They showed photos of my supposedly overgrown lawn, the flower pots that were deemed non-compliant, and the minor fence repair they claimed was an eyesore. Their narrative was simple. I was a homeowner who didn't care about community standards, and my negligence was damaging property values. It sounded convincing, at least to anyone unfamiliar with their pattern of selective enforcement. The judge listened attentively, nodding occasionally, but I could see his expression harden when they exaggerated their claims. When it was my turn, I approached the bench with calm confidence. I began by showing my own record's meticulous photographs with timestamps that directly contradicted their claims. Where they showed an overgrown lawn, I had proof of fresh mowing. Where they pointed to my fence, I had receipts and evidence of timely maintenance. Then I shifted gears, pulling out the real bombshells, evidence of financial mismanagement. I revealed how the board had paid inflated fees to companies run by their own relatives. I highlighted instances of board members ignoring their own supposed rules while targeting others. Most importantly, I showed how the fines they imposed on me and several neighbors had no basis in the HOA's own bylaws. As I spoke, I could see the tide turn in the courtroom. The judge leaned forward, scrutinizing the documents I handed over. The HOAS lawyers began whispering among themselves, their once confident demeanor unraveling. The residents in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, realizing many of them had been victims of the same overreach. I could hear small gasps when I revealed that tens of thousands of dollars had been misused, money that was supposed to go toward community upkeep. The HOA's carefully constructed image was cracking, and for the first time, they looked vulnerable. But the real climax came when I presented a sworn statement from a former board member who had resigned in disgust. In it, they admitted the board had intentionally targeted homeowners they disliked with excessive fines to force compliance or even to drive them out so their homes could be bought cheaply. The judge's eyes narrowed as he read the statement, and I knew the case had taken a decisive turn. The HOAS defense was unraveling in real time, and their once fearsome authority now looked like a petty scheme built on intimidation and corruption. When I finished, the courtroom was silent. The HOAS lawyers scrambled to recover, objecting to small details and trying to discredit my evidence, but the weight of what I had presented was undeniable. The judge called for a recess, and as I walked back to my seat, I could feel dozens of eyes on me. For years, people had been afraid to challenge the HOA, but now they were seeing what happened when someone stood up to them with truth and persistence. As the recess ended, the judge addressed the courtroom with a tone that carried both authority and disappointment. He stated that serious questions had been raised about the HOA's conduct and financial practices. He announced that not only would my fines be dismissed, but a full investigation into the HOAS management would be initiated. The HOA board members sat pale and shaken, their empire of intimidation collapsing before their eyes. Yet even with this victory, I knew the fight wasn't over. The HOA still had resources and they would try to protect themselves, but now the momentum was on my side. Residents who had once been silent began approaching me, offering support and sharing their own stories of harassment. What had started as a personal battle was now becoming a community-wide reckoning, and as I left the courthouse that day, I realized the HOA had underestimated me. They thought I was just one homeowner they could bully into submission. Instead, I had become the spark that could burn down their entire system of control. The war was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted, and the HOAS days of unchecked dominance were numbered. Chapter 6, the end of the HOA day of the final ruling dawned with a tension that seemed to stretch across the entire community. Neighbors whispered about what might happen, some clinging to the hope that the HOA would somehow prevail, while others quietly rooted for me, eager to see the tyrannical board brought down at last. The courtroom was packed, not only with lawyers and HOA board members, but also with curious homeowners who had grown tired of living under the HOAS oppressive shadow. The judge entered, and silence swept across the room as everyone braced for the conclusion of a battle that had stretched on for nearly a year. The judge's words came slow, deliberate, and unyielding. He recounted every action the HOA had taken, every excessive fine, every harassment tactic, every fabricated violation they had attempted to use against me. He highlighted the financial inconsistencies revealed by the audit, noting how the HOA had misused funds meant for community upkeep, diverting them instead into unnecessary legal battles and self-serving projects. By the time he finished laying out the facts, it was clear that the HOA had not only overstepped, but had acted in direct violation of both state law and the association's own charter. The verdict was devastating for them, but liberating for me and every homeowner who had been forced to endure their reign. The HOA was ordered to dissolve immediately, with all remaining funds redistributed back to the community members. The board members, once smug and untouchable, now sat pale and speechless as the judge declared them personally liable for damages. For me, the ruling awarded restitution for the harassment I had endured, but the real victory was far greater than money. It was the freedom of knowing that no one in my neighborhood would ever again live under their control. As words spread, the neighborhood seemed to breathe again. Homeowners who had been silent out of fear began to step forward, sharing their own stories of unjust fines and harassment. People who had avoided each other, wary of being reported for trivial issues, now started reconnecting. There was a new sense of unity that hadn't existed in years. I watched as the for sale signs came down, gardens began to bloom again, and kids played outside without parents worrying about citations for toys left in the yard. The community felt alive, reborn from the ashes of the HOAS collapse. The former board members, however, weren't so fortunate. With the court holding them accountable, they faced personal financial ruin. Some attempted to appeal, but the evidence against them was overwhelming. Their greed and arrogance had backfired so completely that not only had they lost their authority, but they had also destroyed their own livelihoods in the process. The very fines they had wielded against me became meaningless compared to the crushing penalties the court now imposed on them. For me, it wasn't just about winning. It was about proving that one person, when determined enough, could stand up against a system designed to intimidate and control. The HOA had tried to bury me in paperwork, in threats, in financial strain, but instead, they had exposed themselves as corrupt and reckless. My victory was not just mine alone, it was shared by everyone who had ever been bullied by those who thought power made them untouchable. In the months that followed, the neighborhood thrived without the HOA. We formed a simple volunteer group to handle essential maintenance, and without the unnecessary bureaucracy, everything ran smoother than before. The funds that once vanished into the HOAS pockets were now used directly for improvements everyone could see. There were no arbitrary rules, no endless fines, only neighbors cooperating to make their community better. It was proof that people didn't need control, they needed freedom and fairness. Looking back, I realized the HOA had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated me. They thought I would break under pressure, pay their outrageous fines, or eventually give up and sell my home. Instead, I had used the very system they relied on, law, evidence, persistence, and turned it against them. Their obsession with control had blinded them to the fact that they were vulnerable too. And when they finally collapsed, it was swift, humiliating, and irreversible. So, when I walk through my neighborhood now, I don't just see homes and yards. I see freedom. I see a place where families can live without fear of arbitrary punishment. I see kids laughing, gardens blooming, and neighbors smiling again. I see the result of standing firm when it would have been easier to give in. And every time I pass the old community office, now empty, abandoned, a shell of its former self, I'm reminded of the day I took back control of my life. The HOA tried to fine me $500 a day, but in the end, they lost everything. I didn't just win against them, I bankrupted them, exposed their corruption, and restored freedom to an entire neighborhood. They thought they were untouchable, but they forgot one simple truth. When people fight back against injustice, even the most powerful systems can fall. And fall, they did. They did.